What is up everyone? Welcome to part 3. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, I highly recommend you check those out first because everything that we did in those videos has led to this point. And this point that we're at right now, it's all pretty much done. We've got some loose ends to tie up, but the main thing is, did this work? That is the question we're going to be answering today. Was I successful in building my 10 gigabit Ethernet high-speed NAS, high-capacity NAS video editing network? Did it all go to plan? So for the last week or so, I've been running numbers, I've been performing tests, benchmarks, putting it all together, and I have some extremely interesting data to show you guys today. And we're going to do loads of other cool things later on in the video too. So let's do it. Let's complete the project. For anybody that wants a copy of this stuff for themselves, I've put a little download link in the video description with various different formats of these graphs and these results and the specs of the systems and all sorts of handy little things. I will be putting all that on the screen as the video goes on, but I want to have a copy available for those who may need it. So anyone who wants to use this stuff for research or just a reference, or just if you're curious and you want to have a little look around the results in some more detail, I've got all that stuff available for you down in the video description. For the testing, I try to keep it as fair as possible. All the variables, I try to be as fair as I possibly could. I did this across multiple days, but I tried to keep everything consistent. I've done my utmost to make this a fair test and to check at every opportunity that what I'm doing is actually correct and is giving an accurate representation of what's going on with the systems. The computer that I'm using for all of this is an M1 Mac Mini. It's the 16 gigabyte model, so it's Mac Mini, fully updated at the time of recording this video. It's got a 10 gig Ethernet adapter. We'll talk more about 10 gig Ethernet adapters later on in the video. 16 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, everything is standard on the Mac Mini. So that's the system that we're going to be using to chat to all of these other devices and actually run Final Cut from and do all of the testing. That is a consistent. But what we will be doing is testing 3 different types of storage. So first of all, we'll be testing my existing storage solution, the one that I've been using for years and years. That is my external SSD. It's called Hyperspace, and it's basically a Samsung 850 EVO mSATA SSD in a small USB 3.0 enclosure connected locally to the Mac Mini. So that's what I've been using for the longest time. It is basically that versus the new setup. The new setup, of course, is the QNAP NAS, and we went over all of the specs of the QNAP in part 1 and part 2. You saw the configuration in part 2, so we all know about the QNAP system. And just thrown in the mix as well, what I've done, and it's not there for all of the tests, but I've also thrown in a different NAS that I have, my previous most powerful NAS, which in this situation happens to be a Synology NAS. Now this isn't a QNAP versus Synology video. These are wildly different systems. The Synology box that I happen to have is much lower end. You wouldn't really dream of editing from this guy, so that's why it isn't included in the Final Cut test results. It's just included in the general speed test results. But I've thrown that in there as a little bit of a comparison to act as a kind of representation of a normal NAS. So whatever a normal kind of no frills NAS is, then this is a representation of that. Pretty basic stuff, but it's there. You can check all the specs of that as well with the information that I've provided. So I've got my MacBook, so apologies if I'm looking down at any point, but I don't know all this stuff off by heart. There's quite a lot of data to digest. The network layout is exactly the same as my previous video. So we have the Mac Mini connected to the 10 gigabit QNAP switch. We have the QNAP NAS connected to the 10 gigabit QNAP switch. That switch is connected to my existing 1 gig switch. The 1 gig switch is connected to my Dream Machine Pro. So that's the basics of the network. Little diagram on screen right now for anybody who wants to check it out. Let's dive in and check out our first result. The first test to whip out is Blackmagic Disk Speed Test. Now this is a fantastic all-around app if you haven't seen it before. It's ideal for video editors, but also ideal in general if you just want to check the speed of disks. So we have this measuring in megabytes per second, and for our little mSATA SSD, we're getting a typical result, the kind of result that we'd expect from that SSD. So 353 megabytes and 373 megabytes read, write. That's about what I've seen performance-wise from that little SSD since I got it. Looking at the result of my Synology NAS, this is connected via a gigabit network. This guy gets 108.8 and 94.9 read-write. A lot slower, a lot slower. So this is the main reason why you would not want to edit over the network with a solution like this. Gigabit is not really quick enough for a single video editor, especially at a resolution like 4K or even 1080p. It's just not quite capable of it, and the speed of the system overall, not quite up to the mark. But like I said, it's here as a basis for comparison. And finally, the third test is for the QNAP. We get a whopping 819.8 megabytes per second on the read performance. Now, what that shows us right away is that read performance, that app hits the QNAP and it sees those SSDs. Those SSDs are being hammered straight away to give us that lovely speedy read result. On the right, it's displaying is significantly lower than the read speed, but still the quickest write speed out of all of our systems. We have 456.9 megabytes per second for write, so nearly 500 megs per second there. Very speedy write capabilities of this system. So the first thing I did was do some simple small file transfers. Now I settled on a 2.36 gigabyte file. It is a compressed 720p MP4 film, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, for anyone who's interested. And I basically took this file, copied it to my Mac Mini, and then I was seeing how quick would it copy from my Mac Mini to each of these systems. So to the external SSD, it copied that 2.36 gigabyte file in about 6.5 seconds. Very speedy. To the Synology NAS, to get that small file across the network and stored in that NAS was 24 seconds, just over 24 seconds. So still not too bad, but significantly longer than the SSD, of course. And then for the QNAP wins this one with just over 5 seconds to transfer that 2.36 gig file over the network. And you guys kind of saw a glimpse of this when we finished the configuration in part 2 and we transferred that 2-ish gigabyte file and it just went woof, straight across really, really quick. Small file transfers are all well and good, but if you're getting this kit, you're probably going to be transferring hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes at a time. So for our large file transfer test, I chose a 123.8 gigabyte file. It is a Final Cut library file. Now this is essentially just a glorified folder containing loads of other little files, but if you've got Final Cut installed on macOS, it shows as a single file and you can copy the library as one chunk. So 123.8 gigs from my Mac Mini stored locally over to the 3 different storage locations. Now the data for this one really kind of tripped me up. I had to run this and it took ages. I had to run this multiple times to check that everything was working properly and I didn't get some weird data. It came out with these results within the margin of error every single time, and I'm quite shocked. So first of all, the SSD did this transfer in just under 31 minutes, which is quite a long time. It's a big file, so half an hour to transfer a big file. If I was doing this with no basis for comparison, if I was doing this on a random Tuesday afternoon, transferring it over, I probably wouldn't have thought much about it taking 30 minutes. However, when I measured the other systems, it showed me just how long it really took for this to transfer over to the SSD. When I ran this test again and again to double check, I noticed that the slowdown was coming from the final third of the transfer. So I was looking at the progress bar, and as it was going across and the time estimation and everything seemed completely normal, and then it got to about 2/3 of the way along for the SSD transfer, and the last third just took a long time. The majority of that half an hour came from the final third. So it's like that SSD got up to 2/3 of the way and then just like, yeah, I'm going to slow down. And it's strange because there's plenty of capacity on the drive. It just seems to hit some kind of limit with that drive locally connected. Very interesting. So to get that 123 gig file over to Scaro, which is my Synology system, it took 21 minutes. And I was really pleased with that. That's a big file going over in 21 minutes. But then of course, enter the new QNAP NAS and all its bells and whistles, and it transferred this file in just over 5 minutes. So 123 gigs over the network in 5 minutes. Absolutely lovely. So we do have a clear winner for this round. So now we begin with the Final Cut testing. And for these tests, I'm only testing the SSD in the QNAP NAS. I don't have Final Cut editing set up via the Synology NAS. I'm not going to set it up because there's no real need to. It's too slow anyway, we know that. So I've only included the Synology for the tests that it's applicable to. So you're only going to see the SSD in the QNAP. head-to-head, my old versus my new editing system. So for the 4K render test, I'm going to show you guys right now exactly what benchmark I've put together to get these results. So this demonstration is going to serve two main purposes. Firstly, because this is all about video editing, this entire project has been about editing video, I wanted to give you guys the full, complete breakdown of everything that was going on to contribute to the render test and the export test. So instead of just throwing the numbers and the graph up there, I wanted to give you guys all the behind the scenes so you knew about everything that went into those tests. And then that'll give you a better idea of where those numbers have come from, because just a render time on its own doesn't mean very much. So for anyone that doesn't want to look at all the intricate details about this project, feel free to skip past this, go to the timestamp, and I completely get that. But for anyone who is interested and wants to see what went into it, then stick around because we're going to have a complete look around this benchmark that I've created. The second reason for doing this is because this project is currently stored directly on the NAS. It'll hopefully give you guys a decent little representation of just how seamless and smooth this is. So while we're scrubbing around the timeline and looking at different clips, you should just see how responsive the system is. So let's take a look first at what's going on the file side. So if we look at Finder and we go into our NAS, Gallifrey, active projects, libraries, this is the benchmark library that I've created. So it's nearly 60 gigs in size and about 55 gigabytes of that is imported footage. So you guys can see down the side, these are all of our clips, generously given to me by my buddy. I really appreciate it. This is all awesome stuff. I wanted to do something a little bit different, you know, not just use footage that I had of myself doing IMNC stuff. This was a cool opportunity to do something else with the 4K benchmark. So we've got all this lovely footage here, and I've cherry picked some really nice shots to use in the project. Now the project isn't an editing masterpiece by any means. It's a benchmark that I've created. You know, I threw this together in 20 minutes. The majority of the time was kind of deciding what I wanted to do to the footage to make a kind of hopefully real life render test, but also towards the end here of these sections do maybe sort of a slightly more unrealistic portion of the render test, just to see how hard we could push the storage while the data was being read and written to simultaneously. So the footage itself is here, all these different clips, and the footage is directly from a DJI drone. I believe it's the Phantom 4. So if we look at the footage codec, it just comes up as the DJI AVC encoder. So the footage itself, if we look at the project properties, it's 4K, 4096 by 2160 at 25p, and we're rendering to Apple ProRes, and audio wise is just basic stereo 48 kilohertz. So everything is pretty standard and normal here. This is the same throughout the entire process, and for both the project on the SSD results and on the NAS results that you'll see at the end. Again, we're not using the SSD here, we're using the NAS to read this from. In order to do this benchmark, I had to replicate the results over to the SSD. So once I edited this project, I copied the entire library over to the SSD in order to test it there. Now to do this, there was a couple of things that I had to change. Firstly, I use background rendering in Final Cut because I have an M1 Mini and it's of no bother at all. I find it extremely efficient. So in order to do a good, accurate test, it's good to turn the background rendering off for something like this, because otherwise every time you stop editing, it'll just render those clips, and then of course you can't do a render test. So I edited differently for this. I put it all together with the background rendering completely disabled, and then when I was ready to render the project right at the very end, I rendered the entire thing, and that's where that speed result comes from that you'll see in a minute. So background rendering off, so everything I was doing, it wasn't getting rendered. And then when I'd done the test and I needed to copy it over to the SSD, it was really important that I went in and deleted the render files, of course, so that we could perform the render test again. So looking at the project, we have a render files folder, which is right here. I simply deleted the entire thing. So that meant when I relaunched the project on the SSD, nothing was rendered and I could re-render the entire project. So that's all the background and the settings and pretty basic stuff. Let's now take a look at the actual project and see what's going on. So down here in the timeline, looking at audio first, because this is really simple. I've just got a music track and it's just normal stereo audio. This goes all the way through, standard track, and then at the end, I've also inserted a sound effect just for the end portion, just to fill up the audio track really, because the track was too short. What I did was I created one batch of video that you guys can see right here. And then as the song looped around after this breakdown section in the middle that you can see is lower on the waveform here because it's like a quiet portion of the song. When the song kicked back in, I just pasted this entire thing again. So the render and export was basically duplicating twice. I did that so that I didn't have to sit here adding loads more effects to clips and stuff. It was just a really efficient way to kind of prolong the benchmark, make it a bit longer. We wanted a decent, 3 to 4 minute project here. And we do have a 3-minute, 32-second project. So I think that's kind of a nice representation of something like a music video or something along those lines. So looking at the clips, all of the clips on the primary timeline here, on the primary track, have the exact same effects applied. So coming into the video, first of all, we have our letterbox. Pretty basic. A letterbox applied. That's at the 2.35 to 1 ratio, so a sort of CinemaScope ratio on that. Very nice. Next up, we have a color board setting, so you can see slight color alteration to the footage there. Next up, I added another color correction, color curves. You guys can see little alteration there. And then I dragged in a single preset, which is the teal and orange preset. And you guys can see the difference there. So these 4 effects are applied to all of these clips in the timeline here. As you can see, all of these clips, same effect copied over. This is our title. I don't typically use any title effects. I like to be very basic with titles, but I thought for the purpose of the benchmark to give it a little bit more something to render, I used a little sweeping title effect, and I also edited the compositing. So as you guys can see here, the footage still plays in the background of the title. So just something a little bit more intricate there for the render example. Coming over here, this section is a little bit different. I have basically taken the single clip, this one clip right here of the waves just coming into the beach, really nice and slow. I chopped it up in time with the music and I copied each new section over to a new video track. Now as I click on these, you guys will notice that the footage is changing. It's changing slightly in color every single time, and there's a couple of things going on. So essentially what I did was I kept, apart from the teal and orange, I kept the letterbox and I kept the 2 color corrections, and then every single new track I dragged a different effect in. So you guys can see I added film grain to that one. And if you go up, I added all different types of effects, just drag them in from the presets. This one is dry heat. And if we come up to another random example, third from the top, we have the really cool X-ray effect. Now this wouldn't actually be very taxing because we're overlaying the video, but what I've done is I've changed the opacity of all of these clips to 50%. So when it gets up to this track, it's rendering a little bit of all of these effects because it's all in the project. If we have a little look, you can see that all of these clips are dropped down to 50% there to give us our value and to sort of merge all of these effects. So that's what happens. It goes a bit crazy here. And before I rendered this, I had dropped frames, my whole system was stuttering, I ran out of RAM, it was absolutely terrible. But as you guys can see, this is a very unrealistic representation of a video edit. What I was saying was this is kind of a realistic basic representation, and then we just go hardcore here towards the end. So this would never, you'd never do this, of course, but it was just something to push the system. So again, we copied everything over, and this time we did round 2, and we went for it again. Everything is exactly the same. The only difference this time is what I did, I realized when I got to this point I hadn't used any transitions, so I put some cross dissolves at the beginning of these effects. So as these effects come in, each of them cross dissolves in. So again, just that tiny bit more taxing on the render as all of these different effects cross dissolve in. And something else going on with this one, as you can see up here, we have a generator of a white background. And what I did with this guy was I just swooped it in
faded it up gradually across the entire thing. So not only was it rendering all of these effects, again, with opacity at 50% on all of these clips, so rendering a little bit of everything. With the generator at the top, it was just fading in as white, so very, very, very taxing on the render. But, you know, I wanted to give that example, like I've said now, so that's good. The last thing that I did, just to give a little representation of a few more tweaks, I altered the speed of some of these clips. So after this portion here, you guys can see that this clip of the cliffs, as well as this little clip of the sort of coastline there, I edited the speed. So if we look at the timing, this one is increased significantly. This one is increased even more, 800% on that guy. So we've got some retiming of some shots as well. So quite a bit going on here, as you can see. That's what led us to our benchmark. And that's what eventually gave us, after performing the render benchmark and performing the export test, that's what eventually gave us our project file. So for the export is a ProRes export, QuickTime file. Nothing crazy going on. We ended up with a file just shy of 10 gigs for this 3.5 minute project at 4K, and everything went smoothly just as I'd expect. This is again at 25p. So here it is. This is the project applied with all of the effects. This is the section where we're just stacking all of those effects on top of each other. As you can see, it makes the footage look absolutely horrible, but it was there for a render test. So that is a complete look at what gave us the numbers. I think now we can actually take a look at the numbers and see how the render test performed SSD versus NAS.
So the render results are in and very interesting. Ran this one a couple of times and the results were consistent each time. So for the SSD, we have a render time of 3 minutes 32 seconds, so 3.5 minutes for the SSD to get this completed. And for the QNAP, we had 3 minutes 38 seconds, so very, very close. It was like that pretty much every single time I tested it, just a couple of seconds difference. So very, very close results. You can see the SSD just about won. And I think what this shows us is that render is so complex. That was a pretty hefty benchmark, as you saw. I actually ran out of RAM on my Mac Mini. It sent me numerous complaints about the fact that I didn't have enough RAM in my system. I also had dropped frames within Final Cut. The whole thing was grinding to a complete halt. And I'm not just saying Final Cut because of the storage. It was the whole system. It really brought it to its knees. But that little test, especially all of those effects that I stacked up, that was a little bit overkill, I think, for this test. If I could go back again, I'd probably strip it out, but it's fine. What this shows us is, I think, this is the speed, 3.5 minutes or so, was the speed in which the Mac Mini was capable of rendering this stuff. So that was as quick as the CPU was going. That was as quick as the M1 chip was able to go rendering this. And the location of the files and the destination location didn't actually make that much of a difference. I think if I duplicated the library once again and ran it from the internal storage, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw very similar results once again, and then that would confirm the fact that it did take roughly 3.5 minutes to actually process this render, regardless of storage. For the 4K export, the rendering is all done, so you've got a completely rendered project. How long did it take to get this out from Final Cut and as a file that we can actually use? So a nice ProRes file exported directly from Final Cut. For this test, I exported to the same location that the library was stored on. So for the SSD test, I exported from the SSD and to the SSD, and then for the NAS test, it was the same, from the QNAP to the QNAP. So it's consistent across the board. The export time for the SSD was 2 minutes and 18 seconds. So a nice little speedy export time to get a 4K video out of the box. I would have had no problem with that before whatsoever. But the NAS, it took it to the next level and exported it in 1 minute 15 seconds. So you can start to see there where the storage speed comes into play. The machine was obviously able to process the export quicker than the SSD was able to keep up with it. And storage shows that it was able to get that export out there like that, 1 minute 15 seconds straight to the QNAP, because it has quite a bit more bandwidth, as we've seen in the other test results as well. For the next test, it was time to do something with these 4K ProRes files that we'd exported. So I decided to run them through Handbrake and re-encode the files for a standard definition DVD. So this is something that video editors need to do from time to time. Less and less these days, but it's still a nice little test to perform. You might want to do a DVD, you might have a 1080p source, 4K source, but you might need to give somebody a standard definition DVD that they can bung into a normal DVD player and play. So to convert my little 4K ProRes file to DVD, to re-encode it via Handbrake, I tested it on all 3 systems. So on the SSD, as source and destination set to the SSD, 4 minutes, 5 seconds. Nice speedy encode to get a standard definition file suitable for DVD. On the Synology NAS, we have 4 minutes, 41 seconds, a very similar speed result. And again, this shows us that we're pretty much relying here on the speed of the system as opposed to any bottlenecks introduced by storage and the capabilities of whatever storage interface they're connected to. So this gigabit connected kind of lower spec NAS did really well on this as well, because the system was clearly processing it slower than it needed to retrieve and save the files. So 4 minutes 41, very close to the speed of that SSD. The QNAP came in at 4 minutes 9 seconds, pretty much identical to the SSD. So if the 4K test wasn't realistic enough for you, I decided to make the 1080p test much more realistic. So let's check it out.
So I've opened a library here directly on the NAS, and we'll do the same as last time, replicate what I'm doing on the SSD, but do all the work here first. So I've opened up a little project. This is quite short for an IMNC project. This video was around 14 minutes long, and all the files, they're about 10 gig. So 10 gig total, just standard 1080p footage, 29.97. It's all very, very basic normal stuff. This is how 99.99% of my videos are made. And this one particularly is just a single track of video with a couple of images along the way. So absolutely nothing crazy at all. It'll be a really good real world test for myself because the majority of my videos are made like this. So for our 1080p test, I'm going to duplicate this project first of all, and we're going to call it test. We're going to duplicate everything. You can see here the settings that we're using. So we're still ProRes, that's the same, but this is 1080p. So a big difference here over last time. So with this project, the test one that we've just made, I'm going to create a compound clip for this whole thing. That way, what we'll be able to do is apply a small color grade to the entire video here in one step. So this is the whole video, all of the clips condensed down into one clip. And we're just going to make a very, very slight color alteration to the footage, to the entire video. So this whole sort of 14-minute video, and this will need to be rendered. So that will be our render test. So I'm just going to pretend that there needs to be an alteration here. So a slight little move of the colors, and let's just have a fiddle with the saturation. So we've made a couple of small changes here with the colors. And as you can see by the indication here in the timeline, this project now needs to be rendered. So background rendering is still switched off, and I can now render this and perform the test. So I'm going to stop the screen recording to do that so that we get accurate results. First render will be on the NAS, and then the second render will be on the SSD, and then an export test.
Coming in with the results. To color grade that entire 15 minute video, render the whole thing, 4 minutes and 5 seconds for the SSD. Pretty damn good. But it's quite a bit more of a simple task to run than the 4K render. So the CPU wasn't our issue here. We can clearly see that there was a difference. Storage speed made a significant difference to this render time because the QNAP was able to do it in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So around 10 gigabytes, 10 to 15 gigabytes after the render files for this project. So not a big project by any means, but still a benefit to having that faster storage because the system was able to spit out this render really quickly. We noticed the benefit of the 10 gig Ethernet and the quicker NAS with the SSD caching and all of the fancy features. 1080p export is a very similar story. The SSD, 5 minutes, 15 seconds, about what I'd be accustomed to, but the QNAP, once again, 1 minute, 50 seconds. Now this is kind of strange for me, and it just goes to show that you can't take everything that Blackmagic gives you and use that as your only way of judging what disk is right for you. So those are all of my test results. And it was very interesting to see all of these come through and to see these graphs, because it now shows me more than ever, because I even do it myself. I run Blackmagic on a disk and then I form an opinion about a disk or a NAS straight away. And that is it, done in the bag. But it really is not like that. as you saw, sometimes the SSD came out a little bit ahead depending on the workload, sometimes it was even, sometimes there was a huge difference. It is so easy to take those Blackmagic results and go, hey, that's the speed of my NAS, that's the speed of my drive, because they're the numbers on the screen, that's what it's telling you. But this clearly shows that you cannot do that. You have to run the more advanced tests and the real world use case scenario tests to be able to see for your workload what is going to benefit you more when it comes to drives. And hopefully this has given some of you guys a little insight and indication as to how well this kit is coping with those different things. It's kind of crazy because it's taken me days and days to get all of this data in and to make sure that it's all correct. And I've just blasted through it in just a handful of minutes, but hopefully you can see from those numbers that this project has worked. I didn't know what I'd be telling you sat here in part 3 today. Would I be saying it's not quite as quick as the SSD, but it is convenient? Would I be saying they're about the same, but I don't know? No, I'm saying the NAS is quicker in nearly every situation. You get the added convenience. It is just a very sensible upgrade path. Now, of course, we're comparing it to my particular external SSD. You can get quicker external SSDs. You can get some really quick external SSDs now, especially connected via USB-C. But for my little situation here, where I'm going from the 850 EVO mSATA SSD up to the QNAP, that is the kind of difference I'm seeing. So 100% success. And like I said, that's without any further tweaks to the configuration. So the configuration that we did on the fly in part 2 is the configuration that was in place when all these tests were run. I am very pleased with my new video editing box. As a little bit of a bonus, I promised you guys something a bit more extreme. So I've got my MacBook Pro sitting next to my network rack here, and I've got it connected to an old Thunderbolt 2 to 10 gig Ethernet adapter. Because this is an older MacBook Pro, it doesn't have Thunderbolt 3. But Thunderbolt 2 is still 20 gigabit per second, so it's still more than capable of utilizing the full potential of a 10 gig network link. As you can see, I have Final Cut Pro open, and I'm exporting a 1 hour 15-minute 1080p video. This library is stored on the NAS, the video is being exported to the NAS, and this test in itself is nothing special. We just went over loads of similar tests, but what I'm doing at the same time is quite special. The MacBook is sitting down there, and I'm here on my desktop editing another video while that's chugging down there doing all its stuff. So here is the video. This is, again, a library stored on the QNAP NAS, and I'm just editing it. I've been sat here doing a few different bits and pieces, and everything is completely buttery smooth. I cannot notice a difference with that other system running as well. Just to go really crazy, I'm going to open an additional library at the same time. Here is the project loading up straight away. Here it is, playing back. No moment delay at all. Everything is just working. It's playing all of that back, and check this out. You probably won't be able to see from the camera, but this is unrendered footage. Let's play back some unrendered footage. I can't get over this. I cannot get over this. I'm going to perform a full render on this project. So I now have one system doing a really complex render in 4K. I have another system exporting a 1 hour 15-minute video in 1080p. I think what we should do as well at the same time, just for fun, is I've got a couple of these exports stored on the NAS. So let's open some of them. This is the 4K video, the ProRes export. Let's play that file back. There it is. Play it back. Let's play back something else at the same time. We've still got that little 2.38 gig compressed MP4. Let's open that, play that. I'm going to shove that in the corner because I don't want to get a copyright strike. Just for fun, I'm also going to open the standard definition version that we converted using Handbrake. So I've also got these files stored on here that are the screen record files that I used for part 2. All of these files are just playing back from the NAS. If we look over at Final Cut, the render has finished on this project. It was rendering, now it's not. If I check the MacBook Pro is at 47% exported. And I can't see all these anymore, but they're all playing. Look, look at this. This is absolutely bonkers. With all of these playing from QuickTime, you just check the audio. The audio isn't stuttering, the video isn't stuttering. Let's just still click around Final Cut here. Let's do a little something. Fiddle with the color of this one. Making some changes. Just random changes. Go crazy, go really bright, whatever. Cool, go pink. Start a render on that. It's rendering away. All of these files still playing. Did you see that transition? Just how smooth it is. This is a 1080p video playing back. We've still got the 4K video playing back up here as well. How? The export's nearly finished on the MacBook. Crazy. I'm not measuring any of this stuff. I'm just sat here throwing different things at both the MacBook Pro and my main system, and just seeing the results is so cool. It is slamming this thing, but I say slamming, I'm trying to slam it. There's no slowdown anywhere. There's no kind of obvious sign that anything is gonna crash at any point or become disconnected or... I can't really wrap my head around it. This is the first time I've done this. I whipped out my MacBook Pro today and connected it to the 10 gig Ethernet network for the first time, connected it to the NAS for the first time, because I wanted to do this and capture my initial reactions of some of these tests on the camera, and I'm blown away. I was expecting to do one state of Final Cut running on the MacBook in 1080p and then a 4K project here, and that would be probably fine, but then nothing much on top of that, but I can just keep going and going and going. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. This is great fun. After all that really intense testing, I've temporarily pulled the NAS from my main setup, disconnected the power, and also removed all of the mechanical drives, because this afternoon I'm going to be upgrading the RAM in this guy. So I've got some RAM here. This is a 32 gig kit, so two 16 gigabyte memory modules that are going to be going into this bad boy today. So in part one, I touched on the fact that this is an 8 gigabyte model. This is the least amount of RAM that you can purchase one of these with. It comes with a single 8 gigabyte stick, or you can purchase it directly from the factory with 32 gigs of RAM. But a nice way to do this would be to purchase the 8 gigabyte model, and then further on down the road, if you feel like you need a little bit more RAM or you want to take advantage of some of those beefier ZFS features, you can do exactly what we're about to do here and replace the stock 8 gigabyte with the 32 gigabyte upgrade kit straight from QNAP. So to do this, the SSDs can stay in place, the drives need to be removed, and the memory is right there. I've got the unit sitting on its left side, and we can get a good look at the memory. So there is the single factory installed 8 gigabyte SODIMM. Now, a nice thing about doing this upgrade is not only am I going from 8 gig to 32 gig, which is a huge difference, but we're going from single to dual channel memory. So that will also perform much better overall. Not that we need more performance as it stands, but this will just unlock more potential for this system. Being a ZFS NAS, it is slightly more memory hungry depending on the features that you use. So apologies that my hands are blocking the frame here ever so slightly, but we're just removing this. This is the memory that came pre-installed in the system, a single 8 gigabyte SODIMM, DDR4 2666 megahertz. Now it's worth mentioning as well that this NAS does support both non-ECC and ECC RAM, so you can put ECC memory in here if you want that little bit of extra security. And here's one of the replacement modules. This is 16 gigs instead of 8 gigs, pretty much the same thing, DDR4 2666 megahertz, and this is directly from QNAP, QNAP approved memory. I probably would not want to mess around with any memory that is not approved for use by QNAP in something as mission critical as a NAS like this. Probably just worth it to stick to the approved memory. There's the first module in, and now for the second one. A little bit easier to access the top slot with the second module. There's the second SODIMM sitting in its slot, and click. 32 gigs of RAM installed. As easy as that. Since I already had the NAS powered down and removed from the rack, I thought this would be the perfect time to reorganize my setup. In part 2, I spoke briefly about potentially keeping the QNAP NAS external to the rest of my rack, seeing as it's a desktop unit, but
after a little bit of thought and some careful-ish planning, I decided to squeeze it in the rack, and I did this by condensing down all of my existing gear and slimming down on my slightly over-elaborate patching system, which freed up a good 2 or 3 U of rack space. Getting the kit installed was really easy. I used the included rack mount brackets for the switch, and that just sits really nicely above my patch panel. And for the NAS, I decided to put it on a rack shelf. Now I put it on a 5U rack shelf, which is a pretty hefty shelf. Of course, I could have got away with a 1U, 2U, it doesn't really matter, but I wanted the height of the shelf to match the NAS itself, just so it looked nice and clean from the front, and I think I managed to achieve that. While I had the rack out, I decided to make a few other tweaks and improvements to the setup. So I drastically altered the lighting in the rack, which is much better. I've also made a few tweaks to the cooling system, and I've tidied up the cables a lot because the cabling after my previous project was left in a little bit of a mess. And although it probably doesn't appear like this on camera, I really have tried to condense things down and only keep the stuff that I need. So I sacrificed a couple of cable runs out at the back of the rack that I really didn't use. I left a lot of stuff there just in case, but ultimately I've now decided to try and settle on a slightly more simple network. I know it's overkill, but it's great fun, and that's half the reason why we do all this in the first place. So the rack is now completely physically finished, and I am really pleased with the end result.
After I put everything back together and booted up all of my equipment, of course the 32 gigs of RAM that we installed was recognized and everything was working just fine. So any coverage that you guys see of this QNAP NAS on my channel going forward, any additional videos that I make, it'll have the 32GB upgrade installed. Now I haven't even begun to really scratch the surface of what this system can do, so I'm really excited. Now that I've got everything finished and the project is done and it's working and my main purpose of video editing is functioning absolutely perfectly on the NAS, I can't wait to dive in and see just a little bit more of what this guy can do, because it's got so much more to give than what I'm using it for currently. Just before we go, I've got one more treat for you guys, so let's jump over to my desk and check it out. I'm really eager to demonstrate to you guys just how simple and easy it is to connect to a 10 gig network, even if you don't have 10 gig networking built in. Now in part 2, I demonstrated connecting to an adapter over Thunderbolt and everything worked just fine, but I'd been using that adapter for a little while. Here I have two brand spanking new sealed in the box Thunderbolt 3 to 10 gig adapters. I've never used them, and we're going to set them up start to finish on camera, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate just how easy this is. So these look exactly the same. They look like pretty much the same model, but if you look closely, we've got one that's labeled SFP+. So this is the guy that you're going to be using with your fiber cabling and also your SFP+ 10G transceivers. And this is the 10 base T model, the one with the RJ45 connector that will connect to your existing Cat6, Cat6A, Cat7 cabling. So this guy, a little bit easier to slot into the environment that you've already got at home, cabling that you already have probably. This guy, a little bit more complicated because you need to get a hold of some stuff that you probably don't have lying around. But if you do have the fiber cabling, or if you pick up the fiber cabling and the transceivers and you've got all that stuff ready, connecting it is just the same and just as easy. So we'll demonstrate both right here, right now, and show you that 10 gig setup to get your Mac chatting to a switch is really easy. So let's start with the simpler one, the one that we can connect to our existing Cat6 cable that we've got running around the room here. I'm definitely really curious about when Apple are going to start offering more 10 gig options, such as the new iMacs and new Mac Minis that come around. I really hope that it becomes an option, but until then, these adapters are pretty seamless. So if you've got an available Thunderbolt 3 port, which you probably have because most machines come with two, then you can just plug in and just forget about it. It's just as straightforward as having it built in. So here is the 10BASE-T adapter. Really nice. This guy is not hardwired. If I grab another adapter just from over here a sec. This old Thunderbolt 2 to 10 gig adapter that I have, you can see that this one is hardwired. So if you were to break this Thunderbolt cable, you can't actually replace it. If you damage this connector, you've lost the entire adapter, which is a bit of a pain. But with this one, if you break a cable, or you damage the end, you damage the connectors in any way, you can just replace the USB-C cable, so that's nice. USB-C on one side, 10BASE-T RJ45 port on the other side. We've got a little piece of paper here talking about setting the MTU. We'll talk about that in a second. We'll take a little look at that. And then we've just got our little cable in the bottom of the box. So a nice short USB-C cable. Let's plug that side into the adapter and we're gonna hook this guy up right away. As you can see, my system is powered down and I have one lonely Cat6 cable poking up from back here. This is running all the way over to my switch, connected to the 10 gig switch. Here we have the adapter. So I'm going to plug this right in. That adapter is sitting there connected. I'm going to power on my machine and the built-in Ethernet is indeed disconnected. So we have a blue indicator light on the adapter and I can already tell that it's working because we have connected and I can see my share that we've set to mount on startup, which is our active projects share. So we know that this adapter is talking to the network. Let's jump into About This Mac and take a look at System Report. On our Thunderbolt Bus 1, Thunderbolt/USB 4 bus 1, you can see the QNA T310G1T adapter connected. Mode Thunderbolt 3, status device connected, everything is looking perfect. And then within the network portion of system preferences, if we come into the sidebar, we can see our Thunderbolt Ethernet slot 2 is configured. I've obtained an IP address via DHCP, and of course I am chatting to the network and I can see all of my stuff. As you can see, 15 gigs. It is going nice and quickly, so you can see very good speeds. Now, that little piece of paper included in the box, to ensure optimal performance, it is recommended to set the jumbo frames on all devices in your local network environment to MTU 9000. So we can do this on the Mac. There's instructions right there in the box. Network, Thunderbolt adapter, advanced, hardware, configure manually. And this is the secret here. You can see we have all of our speeds, but we want to increase this to jumbo 9000. Apply the changes. On the QNAP NAS, I'm going to open Network and Virtual Switch. Under Interfaces, we see the one that we're connected to, the 10 gig port. We're going to configure this one. Under the IPv4 tab, we can set the jumbo frame to 9000, then hit Apply, and everything should function absolutely perfectly. 15 gig file, dropping on the desktop, and we've got a lovely speedy transfer. So you just plug it in and it works. Now we're going to try the other one, see if it's just as easy. This is the SFP Plus model. I have not tried an SFP Plus adapter on my machine, so I'm expecting this to be just as straightforward as the 10BASE-T version. Inside we have the adapter, very much the same, again removable USB-C cable, and this time we have our SFP Plus port on that side. A little bit of a difference in colouring between these two. One is silver, the other is a sort of goldish colour. So we're going to disconnect this 10BASE-T model and reuse this USB-C cable because they're both just the same USB-C cable. Same paperwork in the box with this guy as well. Now, of course, what we will need for this guy is a transceiver because we're going to connect it to a fiber cable. So this is where some of the additional expense comes in if you don't have this stuff lying around already, and maybe will be a little bit more convenient to look at the 10BASE-T adapters. But there are also advantages to using the SFP Plus adapters as well. One of those being fan noise. Now, 10BASE-T runs really hot. So there is a little fan in this guy to keep it cool. Not all of them are fan cooled, this guy is. You can't really hear it, especially in my environment over the network rack, but there is a little fan in here just to be aware of that. So earlier on in the video, I ran, during the rack rebuild, a fiber cable all the way from the QNAP switch over here, and we are going to connect this to our adapter. Boom, in, and the other end, USB-C. Now we see the same blue light come on. Let's pop that on top of the other guy. We've completely disconnected our Cat6 cable, of course, because we've unplugged this entire adapter. So let's jump back into our machine and see exactly what's going on. Because I unplugged that previous adapter, we've lost connectivity to our network share, but let's just check and see if that's back up and running. So network, aha, and look, Gallifrey right there, connecting. And there it is, there's our active share. So we know that this is working on the network. Let's do the same set of tests about this Mac. Mode, Thunderbolt 3, speed up to 40 gigabits per second. Network, IP address is there, obtained via DHCP. And again, recommended to adjust our jumbo frame by setting the MTU to 9000. Apply. I'm going to try an even bigger file this time just to have a little look and see how far we get with that. 63 gig file, about 3 minutes. Now about 2 minutes. So you guys can see we are connected and working just fine. 10 gig, this time with the SFP Plus connection from the Thunderbolt 3 to SFP Plus adapter. So there we have it. We are completely done. Now, just before I sign out, I've got a couple of thank yous. I just have to say thank you to these people. First of all, a huge thank you to my good buddy and work colleague, Bosco. He gave me all of that wonderful drone footage that I used in the 4K benchmark. He just gave it to me on a drive and I was able to do whatever I wanted with it. So buddy, huge thank you. And for anyone who's curious, the majority of that footage was recorded just about 5 minutes up the road from where I live. And the rest of it, the shots with the sea coming in and whatnot, recorded just probably about half an hour down the road. So you guys get a little insight into what our little out in the sticks area looks like here in Wales. Secondly, I want to say a massive thank you to my buddy John. John actually messaged me after part 2 and offered me some 1 gig SFP transceivers and 2 different lengths of fiber cable. He just sent them over here completely free of charge after I had that trouble with the DAC cable because it was a 10 gig DAC cable communicating between the 2 switches. He sent me some 1 gig transceivers. I'm now connected with fiber, it's working perfectly. So that little hiccup that we had, I can confirm, if you put a 1 gig transceiver in the QNAP switch, it will talk to other 1 gig SFP equipment, so that's fantastic. We're communicating now without sacrificing any of the RJ45 ports on either switches, which is exactly how I wanted it. So John, huge thank you for sending that stuff over. I really appreciate it. And finally, I just want to say another massive thank you to Tam and all the awesome guys at QNAP for allowing me to do this project and to showcase this wonderful equipment to you guys. I was given complete free rein and able to say anything that I wanted with this gear. They just gave me the gear and said, hey Tom, do your thing. And I have had a whale of a time. It's been phenomenal. And I really hope you guys have enjoyed seeing my journey, going from someone who's never deployed a 10 gig network, someone who's never used a high-speed NAS of this capacity, this capability. It's just been a wonderful learning experience, and I can't wait to further demonstrate this equipment to you guys. As time goes on, it'll be in all sorts of videos as we go forward. This is a now main core portion of my network, so it's wonderful to have it, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So QNAP, thank you so much. So that's it. We're done. I hope you guys have enjoyed. I hope you've all learned something. I definitely have. It's been great fun, as I say. I want to thank you all for your views and comments. I learned a lot from the comments, especially in part 2 after the configuration. I will be making a few little changes to my configuration based on a couple of suggestions in the part 2 comments. So if you're watching this and you want to learn a little bit more from people that maybe know quite a bit more than myself, you can have a read of the part 2 comments, and people have left some really good suggestions down there for some tweaks that could possibly improve the configuration even further, which is crazy. So absolutely fantastic, and I really do appreciate all the feedback throughout these videos. I've been making them and uploading them as I go, so I've been reading your feedback, and it's just wonderful to hear all the things that you guys are sharing. So thank you so much. Amazing, brilliant. I've had a whale of a time. I'm going to sign out now and enjoy editing the remainder of this video from this lovely QNAP NAS. I'll see you all in the next video.